Good morning, good afternoon, or good night, and welcome to Command Power, the show in which we discuss all things Magic the Gathering with a focus on Commander. And today we have a brand new deck for you, and just as a quick heads up, this is not a budget deck, although I do think it should be fairly easy to find substitutes for those expensive cards. But before that, just a quick reminder to please click like and subscribe if you enjoy my videos. We're well on our way to 1 million subscribers, and every single click counts. And today we're going to be doing our first deck from the Doctor Who set, and we're going to be talking about the Master Multiplied. For 4 colorless, 1 black and 1 red, it's a legendary creature, Time Lord Rogue 4/3 with Myriad. The legend rule doesn't apply to creature tokens you control, and triggered abilities you control can't cause you to sacrifice or exile creature tokens you control. Judging by the views on this video, you guys are just as excited as I am about the Master, so I thought I'd kick off the deck text for this set with him. He's really cool because he has such a unique build around. Obviously, Myriad is the main thing we're going to be focusing on because he works so well with Myriad. As long as you have him out, a single Myriad creature is going to create more and more tokens of itself every turn, and if they stick around, then they're going to be able to multiply themselves in future turns, and it's just going to grow bigger and bigger. This makes him basically an army in a can with any Myriad creature, and look at that, he has Myriad himself. So obviously he's very solid if you can protect him. We do have quite a few protection effects in the deck because of that, because we want to make sure that he doesn't get removed very easily. Other than Myriad, there's quite a few effects in red that make tokens that disappear at end of turn, so we've leaned into that quite heavily. We also have some good creatures with enter the battlefield effects that we can copy with our token making effects. And then they're going to stick around permanently, so that's a really nice option to have. Of course, we've also included Blade of Selves as one of the linchpins of the deck to give those creatures Myriad. But anyway, without further ado, let's get started with the list. I'm really excited about this one. So starting off, we have Banshee of the Dread Choir. The first time you attack with this, she's going to be great, because when this connects, people are going to have to discard a card. That means that they're going to want to block your tokens, so we do want to make sure that at least one of them survives so that we can keep doing it turn after turn. If your opponents don't have good blockers for this, they're going to be in a world of trouble though, because she's just gonna multiply and multiply with the Master out. Combat Celebrant is a pretty good card because being able to have extra combat steps works really well with Myriad since it triggers upon creatures attacking. So obviously we really like having this out, and we have quite a few ways to copy it, and if we do, it's just going to be so solid because we're going to get multiple extra combat steps, and with the Master out, that basically translates to game over very, very quickly. Cyberman Squadron is a really solid card in the deck. Even if it just gave Myriad to itself, it would already be pretty good with the Master because we're really hungry for Myriad effects, but we do have about 4 or 5 other artifact creatures in the deck that all benefit from getting Myriad. One of those creatures is Dalek Drone, for example, which is really good when you have Cybermen Squadron out, because being able to get multiple copies of it that destroy a creature whenever they come into play is great, and it has Flying and Menace as well, which means that as long as we can keep Cybermen Squadron alive, this is very likely to just keep multiplying turn after turn after turn, which is obviously a very good way to win the game quickly. Dalek Squadron is a pretty decent Myriad card because having Menace again means that we can keep it alive more easily when it attacks, and that with the Master out means that it can become an army in a can very quickly. Delina Wild Mage is a really solid card that I like putting in a lot of my decks, but it's particularly good here. So if we get a really good roll, we can start going really, really nuts. And we have so many synergies by making token copies of cards with ETB abilities. But even if you just roll a 1 to 14, getting an extra copy of a creature can be huge in this deck, particularly since our creatures are quite impactful. Eltural Survivors is a really good card. Late game, this can deal so much damage. I actually like this card a lot, even without any special synergies. I think it's a generically good card in Commander these days because people have so much ramp and there's so many lands in play most of the time. At its very worst, it's usually going to be a 4/4 with Trample that has Myriad. That would already be fine. But in this deck, with all the synergy we have, this gets really, really insane. With the Master out, this can end the game so quickly by making so many copies of itself. Felden of the Third Path is a classic in red decks, but I like it more than usual in this deck because, of course, we get to keep those tokens that we're making with it, which is really, really nice. It also allows us a little bit of recursion. If somebody deals with one of our important cards, we can just reanimate it with Felden. Furbolg Flutist is an absolute all-star in this deck. When you start making multiple copies of it with the Master every turn and stealing your opponent's stuff, it's going to be really, really powerful. We also have a lot of sacrifice outlets in this deck. Flamer's Rider is yet another way to get an extra token when it attacks. We do need to be careful that we're attacking somebody that can't block it because it's quite fragile. But once that is true, then this becomes very, very powerful. And obviously with extra combat steps like we have in this deck, then it's going to be very easy to abuse this. Genasi Enforcers comes down early and has a decent body in the early game, but it's just another creature with myriad basically. However, if we pump a little bit of mana into it, we can get huge buffs when we have a bunch of copies of this in play. Null Warband I really like if you can make sure that it comes down for cheap, and you should be able to because we have all of these myriad effects, which means most players should be dealt damage quite consistently. When that's the case, you can just bring this down for very cheap, and then it's a huge menacing myriad creature, which is exactly what this deck wants. Hellcat Courser is absolutely perfect for this deck, so we can even do it on turn 6 if we have nothing else going on and get to put the Master into play immediately with haste. Now, since the Master is going to make 2 extra copies of itself with its own myriad ability, we basically get to keep it around. So we can kind of cheat on the mana and have our cake and eat it basically, but it gets even better later game when we've cast a Master a couple of times and it's been removed, and normally it would cost us 10 mana or something, and now we can just get it down for 6 and keep it around as well. It's really, really good in this deck. Jaxis the Troublemaker is a great card in this deck because crucially it gives the ability to draw a card when the creature dies to the token copy it creates. That means that if we put it on a card with myriad, for example, all of those myriad copies are going to retain that ability. Obviously they're not usually going to die if we have the Master out, but this is good if the Master is out or if it isn't, because that ability stays on there. And even if those tokens don't die for a bunch of other turns, when they do eventually die, we're going to draw cards off them. And then of course they can multiply themselves if the Master is out, which just makes it so perfect. We can get so much card advantage with this little card in the deck. So Carter Doomscourge is an interesting one to give myriad to. We're not going to be able to double up on the trigger because it says until your next turn. However, what we are going to be doubling up on is all of those drain life effects. So if we have multiple of these out thanks to myriad and the Master, then it should allow us to end the game incredibly quickly. Carrie Zev's Skyship Raider is a really interesting card because usually she's just a 1/3 that doesn't really do that much, but in this deck we get to keep the monkey token she creates, which is pretty solid even though he might not always survive. There is one combo as well with her that we'll talk about later on in the deck, and it's pretty solid. So Karlach is obviously a very good card in Commander, and it fits very well in this deck by giving us extra combat phases, which is something that we totally want with the Master. Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker is a really solid card which allows us to make tokens which are usually going to disappear at end of turn, but they get to stick around. Lagamus Hand of Hatred is a pretty solid one. We're going to get tokens that get to stick around if they survive combat, which isn't necessarily very likely. And also we have a bunch of sacrifice outlets and should eventually have a lot of tokens lying around, so we should be able to use his second ability, which is really good. And the second ability is just good in general because whenever there's a board wipe or any kind of situation like that, you just get to search a library for a card. Manaform Hellkite is unbelievably good in this deck. We have a ton of non-creature spells, and they're all going to be making dragons with haste that get to stick around if we have our commander out. Mirage Phalanx is just a great way to get some more value out of our ETB creatures or our creatures that provide ongoing value, and it's just a really solid card in this deck. Necron Deathmark is basically a removal spell stapled onto the creature. It works really well with Cyberman Squadron and all the other ways we can give creatures myriad. Ortheon Hero of Lava Brink is a great way to get some extra token copies of stuff. If we ever think the coast is clear, we can also late game just go for the Hail Mary and pay 9 mana to get 5 tokens, though I don't think I've ever seen that actually go off because people just always get blown out by it. Ravenous Chupacabra is another removal spell on a creature that works really well when it's copied. Rionia Fire Dancer is a great way to make token copies of stuff. We don't have that many instants or sorceries, but even just doing it once per turn is already very good. Solemn Simulacrum is great value and a great card to make token copies of. Tiamat's Fanatics and War Chief Giant are functionally the same card. Tiamat's Fanatics is a little bit worse because it has 1 less power, but they're just basically good creatures with haste and myriad. Aoma, Marshal of Roan, is one of the ways we can win the game out of nowhere and kind of go infinite if we have enough setup. We basically need a sack outlet, our commander out, and a way to make copies of Aoma, and we can just kind of go infinite with him, which is really solid. We can also substitute some of those pieces with other cards in the deck, so Carrie Zev works pretty well there because she's making a legendary token when she attacks, but in any case, it's pretty easy to trigger this in this deck, and even if we're using it in the fair way, we're still getting a bunch of extra combat steps. Moving on to artifacts, we have Ashnod's Altar to take advantage of all these tokens we're going to be making. Blade of Selves is obviously one of the best cards in the deck. It is very expensive to equip, but we have a few ways to make a lot of mana in this deck, so it shouldn't be too bad. Crowded Crypt is very solid. It's going to get counters on it whenever any creature we control dies, and eventually we can trade them in for a bunch of zombies with Decayed, which are usually not great, but since we kind of negate the effects of Decayed with our commander, it becomes pretty solid. Honor Worn Shaku is very good in this deck, seeing as our commander makes token copies of himself and he is legendary. We also have a bunch of other legendaries and we have ways to give them myriads, so that is all really good with this card. Mimic Vat is a great way way to reuse creatures that died. We can even steal stuff from our opponents for added fun, and then we get to keep the tokens as well, thanks to the Master. Correction, Altar is another way to use the tokens we're making to get some mana advantage. Relic of Legend is similar to Honor Worn Shaku as a way to get some extra mana from our legendaries. Orobrask's Forge I really like in this deck. It's going to make progressively bigger and bigger tokens, which get to stick around if they're not removed by our opponents, which is very powerful. It also synergizes very well with all the extra combat steps we're taking in this deck, because we're going to get to put 2 counters per turn if we take an extra combat on that turn. And Whisper Silk Cloak is a good way to make sure our commander doesn't get removed and also gets to swing through. It fits very well in this deck, but you do need to make sure you don't get blown out by a removal spell in response to the equip. For instance, we have Bolt Bend to protect the Master. It's only going to cost 1 mana, which is very good. Deflecting Swap will be free to protect the Master. I don't usually put these very expensive cards in the deck, but it's kind of essential in this deck that you keep your commander alive. Kazul's Fury is a good way to sacrifice something at instant speed and deal a last bit of extra damage. Lethal Scheme I really like because we're going to be making so many tokens. It's a great way to remove something for very cheap and get some card selection. Malakir Rebirth is great in response to a removal spell on some of our important creatures. Nasty End is going to be great in this deck with all the legendaries we have. Even the token copies that we make are often legendaries, so that's just great. And Pylon is very similar to Lethal Scheme as a good way to destroy a creature or planeswalker and get a little bit of card selection. For enchantments, we have Aggravated Assault, which is a great way to take extra combat steps, and since we have so many ways to sacrifice our creatures for mana, it's actually quite easy to just go infinite with this with all the tokens we're making. Determined Iteration is a great way to get more token copies out of our token copies. Also, it triggers at the beginning of combat, so when we take extra combat steps, we're going to get more triggers out of this. Fable of the Mirror Breaker is just a great card in so many different decks, but the flip side is what we're really interested in here, because we're going to get Reflection of Kiki-Jiki, which works very well with what the deck is trying to do. Flame Shadow Conjuring is a great way to get some extra copies of our creatures for even more value. Industrial Advancement is one of my favorite cards, and it also allows you to get a little bit more value out of those tokens at the end of turn if you don't have your commander out. If you do have him out, it's still fine to sacrifice one of them and get another creature out of the deal. And Mirage can be very good if you're good with those coin flips. I'm personally not super great with this, but if you are, then absolutely go nuts. For sorceries, we have Hate Mirage, which is a really fun card in my opinion. You get to choose 2 copies of stuff that your opponents control. With our commander out, we actually get to keep those copies as well, which is really nice. Heat Shimmer basically does something very similar, but we can also choose our own creatures if we want to. And Seize the Day is a great way to take extra combat steps. We often don't really need too many extra combat steps before we're just winning the game. For lands, we have High Market, which is a nice free sack outlet. Inventor's Fair is going to work very well with all the artifacts we have to gain us a little bit of life and then search up our Blade of Selves. Erection Tower is a great way to use those tokens we're making to get some more mana. Rogue's Passage is a really good way to sneak in some damage. It can also be great if we don't have a clear attack with some of our creatures like the Master Multiplied. The Black Gate is again another way to make sure we have at least one good attack with our creatures with Myriad. With our Myriad creatures, we don't really care where the main creature is going, so it's nice that this can just basically always guarantee it's going to get through. And Tomb Fortress can be pretty solid to get us a little bit of value by reanimating something from our graveyard. So there you have it. That has been the Master Multiplied deck list. What do you think about this one? I couldn't be more excited about this and can't wait to throw it together and go nuts with all of these Myriad creatures attacking multiple opponents at once. I don't know if it's going to be the most competitive deck, but it's certainly going to be really, really fun. So let me know what you think about this one in the comment section below. Are there any suggestions you think that would fit well in this deck? Please let me know in the comment section below, because I'm always looking to improve it. And if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to click like or subscribe. It really helps the channel. And until next time, take care.